In the last video, we finished on this slide and we were talking about the idea of an optimal currency area, which is basically a geographic region that uses a common currency. Think of that geographic region as involving a range of different countries that uses a single currency and can benefit from the use of a common currency. So using a common currency across a range of countries sometimes can be problematic, other times it can be very beneficial. It depends upon the countries involved and whether those countries satisfy four main conditions that Robert Mundell in the 1960s put forward. And so what are the conditions for, or the criteria, I've called them, for an optimal currency area? So I'm going to go through these four and explain to you what they are and why they're required. But remember what we're doing here. We've got four criteria that a group of countries need to satisfy before they can benefit from the adoption of a single currency. If a group of countries don't satisfy these, then it's very likely that the adoption of a single currency is going to do far more harm than good. Okay, so the first criteria that this group of countries must satisfy is highly correlated business cycles. What that means is that when one country is booming, ideally the other country should be booming as well, or the other countries should be booming. And if one or two countries are in recession, all the countries should be in recession. So we want the business cycles to coincide of the different countries that are using this common currency or that have adopted this common currency. The reason for this is because if a group of countries adopt a common currency, they have to have a common central bank setting a common interest rate across all of the countries. And we've kind of explored the idea of maybe different states of a country like Australia or the United States, or a different group of countries like the countries of Europe trying to maintain integration, but at the same time having different interest rates. It's just not going to work. So because any group of countries that adopt a common currency, because they must have a single central bank and common interest rates across those countries to maintain financial integration, ideally, you don't want the business cycles of those countries to be asymmetric. You want them to be highly correlated. So ideally, if all of these countries were booming at the same time, then interest rates could be set high. If they were all going into contraction at the same time, interest rates could be set low. The problem comes when you have one group of countries that have adopted the common currency booming, another group in recession. Then the question becomes, well, where do you set interest rates? And the answer would be you'd set them at a fairly neutral level. If you set them too low to help the countries that were moving into contraction, you'd just be fueling additional inflation in the countries that are booming, and vice versa. If you set interest rates too high, you would then be causing untold damage to the countries that are moving into contraction. So in that situation, interest rates have to be kept fairly neutral to avoid doing damage in one of those groups of countries. And so monetary policy largely becomes ineffective at any point in time where the business cycles of those economies are no longer symmetric. Now, if all the countries are broadly moving through the same cycle, then yeah, monetary policy can be used reasonably effectively. But the problem really occurs when one group of countries is booming and another is in recession. Now, in terms of Europe, does Europe satisfy condition number one? Because Europe has adopted a common currency, but these are the four conditions that Europe must satisfy for that common currency to be effective. So does Europe have highly correlated business cycles? And when I say Europe, I mean European countries using the euro currency. So obviously there's some European countries that haven't gone down the euro path, but we'll ignore that. So are their business cycles highly correlated? The answer, absolutely not. Over the last 15 or so years, there's been numerous examples of the German economy in particular being very, very strong, whereas Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, the pig countries, you may not have heard that expression. PIGS is PIIGS, stands for Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. The pig countries, while Germany has been booming, have been in recession. So number one, not satisfied by Europe. What about a common fiscal authority? Why is that important? Well, it's important. A common fiscal authority means an organization that can collect tax revenue and spend that money wherever it likes across the countries of Europe. So let's go back to number one. The question is that I want to throw at you is, do we have that in Australia? Do we have common business cycles or correlated business cycles? Even in Australia, the answer to that is no. There's been many times where the WA economy has been booming, mainly because of a mining boom. That has placed upward pressure on the exchange rate and harmed exporters in the eastern states of Australia. And those economies have, well, the growth in those economies have slowed considerably. So we don't have number one in Australia. Now remember, these are theoretical criteria that, if satisfied, makes the countries that we're examining ideally suited for a common currency. Turns out you don't need to satisfy all of these, but if you did, it would be an ideal situation. Now in Australia, we don't satisfy number one, highly correlated business cycles, but we do have a common fiscal authority. And the importance of that goes like this. Let's just imagine the WA economy is booming because of a mining boom. The states in the eastern states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, Tasmania, let's assume that they are contracting. Why? Because the mining boom in WA has pushed the Australian dollar to a very high level, and exports in those other states of Australia have suffered. Now, monetary policy would have to be set at a fairly neutral level. So in that situation, where the business cycles have become asymmetric, monetary policy is not effective. But in Australia, we do have a common fiscal authority, federal government, which can collect tax revenue and spend that money wherever it likes. So having a common fiscal authority in Australia is our way out of that problem of having asymmetric business cycles. So if the WA is booming and the eastern states are going into contraction, then the federal government could either collect tax revenue from WA and perhaps, and also borrow money and use that tax collection from WA, use the borrowed money to, for example, undertake infrastructure spending projects in Queensland, New South Wales, and Melbourne, create more aggregate demand in those economies, those state economies, and hopefully move them out of their contraction phase. Hopefully you can see how that works. So when we get into a situation where the business cycles in states of Australia are out of line, we can use fiscal policy to help out the states, in Australia's case, that are moving into contraction. So while we don't have number one in Australia, we do have number two. Let's go back to Europe. The question then becomes, well, if Europe doesn't have number one, does it have number two? Well, of course not. Of course it doesn't. Now, there have been situations of the German government and the French government lending money to Greece, lending money to the Greek government, so the Greek government could then spend that money, create aggregate demand, create employment during times of recession in Greece. That has happened. The problem with that is that money needs to be repaid. And so let's just imagine you're now a citizen of Greece and you see the Greek government borrowing. Let's just imagine you're a citizen of Greece and you see the Greek government borrowing very large amounts of money from the German government, but you know that money needs to be repaid. And you're doing some work for the Greek government and you get part of this additional spending that hits your bank account. What are you going to do? Are you going to then go out supremely confident and spend that money and kick off a multiplier process? Or are you fully aware that in the future, your tax rates may well have to rise to repay that debt and maybe then tuck that money away and not spend it? Well, the reality is probably a combination of the two. But what I'm getting at is if the German and French governments are lending the Greek government money, then the impact of that spending in Greece is going to be moderated to some extent by the understanding among the Greek people that that money will have to eventually be paid back and their taxes in the future will be higher. Compare that to this situation. You're still living in Greece, working in Greece. Greece is in recession. But now Germany and France, rather than lending Greece the money, hands the money over with no interest, and the money doesn't have to be repaid. It's just the same as taxing WA, moving that money to Victoria and spending that money on an infrastructure project in Victoria. Hopefully you can see the parallels now. So then the question becomes, if you then earned money from the expenditure of the Greek government, would your behaviour differ knowing that that money that was given by Germany and France to Greece doesn't have to be repaid and therefore your taxes won't increase in the future? Of course you would respond differently. You're much likely to then take that money, spend it and kick off a multiplier process. And so are all of your friends and family. So by having a common fiscal authority, it does allow business cycles to be smoothed out when different countries, different states suffer from asymmetric business cycle fluctuations. So even though Australia and Europe don't have number one, at least Australia does have number two. The United States is another example. The United States doesn't have number one, but it does have number two. Now that doesn't mean number one is not important, because highly correlated business cycles, remember what we're doing? We've got a list that was provided by Robert Mundell in the 1960s, a list of ideal characteristics So obviously, if all four were in existence, then that would be a very powerful situation for the countries that have adopted a common currency to be in. Okay, let's go on to number 3. High labour and capital mobility throughout the area. What does that mean? That means that both labour and capital, and when I say capital, I'm thinking machinery, trucks, tractors, that sort of thing, as well as all other capital equipment. But workers and capital have to move from, or be willing to move from, areas that are in recession during asymmetric business cycles to areas that are booming. So move from areas where the unemployment rate is high and wages are probably falling and rents on capital are falling, to areas that are booming where wage rates are rising and rental rates on capital are rising as well. Imagine the effect that that would have by having workers move from a country such as Greece that might be in recession to, say, Germany, which might be booming. By moving labour supply and capital supply from Greece to Germany, you're providing the German economy with the additional labour and capital it needs. But you're also removing the excess supply of labour and capital from Greece, and you will then be preventing wages and rents on capital falling in Greece by as much, and you'll also then be moderating the growth in wages and capital in Germany, which will take pressure off the production costs of businesses. Now, do we have a high degree of labour and capital mobility in Australia? The answer is yes, a reasonably high degree of mobility. If you sort of look around the Western Australian economy over the last 10, 12 years, you'll notice that a lot of people came from the eastern states during WA's mining boom in the early 2000s. They came from the eastern states and started working in the mines. And that really helped out. And the US has a similar degree of capital and labour mobility as well. So then the question becomes, well, does Greece and Germany, Greece in recession, Germany booming, as an example, is there the same degree of labour and capital mobility? Now, capital mobility is a hard one to tie down. I haven't seen too much research on that, but let's focus on labour mobility. The answer is they don't have as much labour mobility as Australia. And so then the question becomes, well, why? Let's just imagine, once again, you're living in Greece, but rather than being the person you are now, you're a Greek version of yourself, if that makes sense. So you have different customs, cultures, you speak a different language to the language you speak now. You speak Greek. What are the barriers in terms of then you moving to Germany? It's all of those things that I've just mentioned. Potentially language issues, cultural issues, etc. I'm not saying that you won't move from Greece to Germany. I'm just saying that the movement of labour more generally, more broadly, won't be as great as it would be from, say, Melbourne to Perth because of those language, cultural aspects. Okay, so Australia has number 3, Europe to a lesser extent. The final criteria is price and wage flexibility. Now, this last one is important if number 2 doesn't exist and number 3 doesn't exist. So let's just imagine we've got asymmetric business cycles. Even though we might have a common fiscal authority, the fiscal authority is not substantially moving expenditure from high growth areas to recession areas. For whatever reason, just for the sake of this exercise, we'll assume that's not happening. So we've got a booming region, a recession region, and money is not being spent in the recession region. The region could be a state, it could be a country, you get the idea. Then at the same time, capital and labour is also not moving from the recession region to the booming region. Doesn't matter why, it's just not. We're just going through a thought exercise now. That's the case, asymmetric business cycles, no fiscal sharing of expenditure, no capital and labour mobility, then the last chance that the recession area has to actually move out of recession is price and wage flexibility. Because this region that's in recession, it's really stuck. It doesn't have a monetary policy helping it out because monetary policy has been set at a neutral level. With interest rates at a neutral level and this country in recession, the currency of this region won't get pushed down. If we're talking about a single country and that country goes into recession, what the central bank will do is slash interest rates. That'll put downward pressure on the exchange rate, which will help that country move out of recession by boosting net exports. But now we've got a country that's in recession, it's using a common currency, and it's one of many countries. Interest rates are set at a neutral level. The currency that this country in recession has adopted, that is not getting pushed down because interest rates haven't been slashed. There's no labour or capital mobility. Hopefully you can see the problem that this country, this region is in. You don't have your own interest rates. You don't have your own currency, so therefore you don't have an exchange rate that you can depreciate as an individual country against other countries' currencies. You don't have the hope of any fiscal transfers, and your labour and capital is just staying in the country, being unemployed. Number 4 then becomes important. If you are stuck in that situation that I've just described, the last chance you've got is price and wage flexibility. That is wages that you pay your workers and also the rent you pay capital falling over time. And as that happens, businesses can then pass those lower wage and rent costs on to customers in the form of lower prices. With lower prices, there is a chance that people in your country will then take their savings and start purchasing goods and services at a now lower price. And if prices and wages fell like that, you'd probably have people coming from other countries picking up goods and services at falling prices as well, which would then really increase, well, it would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Because remember, the aggregate demand curve is all about spending in terms of real GDP. And real GDP is price adjusted or inflation adjusted GDP. Real GDP is really the quantity of goods and services that are being sold. Because in calculating real GDP, we keep prices constant. So with prices constant, if real GDP goes up, it's because we are producing physically a greater quantity of goods and services. So if prices fall and wages fall, then it means people and foreigners can buy a greater quantity of goods and services in your country, which then is going to increase real GDP and help move you out of the recession that you're in. So does Australia have the type of wage and price flexibility that would allow a state, if it went into recession, ignoring the fact that in Australia we do have number 2, but doesn't any individual state have that degree of wage and price flexibility? The answer is no. It would take years and years and years of recession for any state to have its wages, its rental rates on capital, and its prices to fall by enough to move out of recession. We've sort of already discussed that idea in the context of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. But more interestingly, does Europe have that? Price and wage flexibility, or enough flexibility for a country that is in recession to move out of the recession in the absence of 1, 2, or 3? And the answer is no. It just doesn't. So let's look at these 4 criteria in the context of Europe's suitability for using a common currency. Doesn't satisfy 1, doesn't satisfy 2, doesn't have a common fiscal authority, doesn't satisfy 3, doesn't satisfy 4. See where I'm going with this? Then why adopt it? In terms of Europe, there is no effective way for a country that goes into recession, or a group of countries such as the pig countries, for those countries to go into recession. There's no effective way to get those countries out of that recession. The presence of number 2 would solve all of those problems. And so that's why we've seen countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, with unemployment rates in the double digits for years and years and years, slow economic growth. I won't go into details, but just do your own research on the economic performance since the global financial crisis of Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Not so much Ireland, but those other countries in Southern Europe. Have a look at the economic performance. Look at the growth rates of the unemployment rates in particular. The unemployment rates have been incredibly high. So then the question becomes, well, why? Well, you're looking at the reason why on the screen. Because Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain don't satisfy any of the criteria to use a common currency. Not one. So Greece goes into recession after the global financial crisis. They have a debt crisis. They default on their debt. The economy is in real trouble. Youth unemployment rates, I think, were up around 25%. Then the question is, well, how does Greece get out of recession? Well, if it had its own currency, if it had never joined the euro in the first place, and it had the same crisis, it would have slashed interest rates to 0. Investment money would have fled Greece, so people would have sold their bonds and shares and moved that money out of Greece. And those two things, low interest rates and a movement of investment money out of Greece, would have caused an absolute collapse in the Greek currency. I'm talking about if Greece had never entered the euro. And the collapsing of its exchange rate would then be the first step to recovery. Collapsing of the exchange rate would boost boost net exports, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Just imagine that. Greece is in crisis. It is not using the euro and its exchange rate is incredibly cheap. Where would everyone in Europe go for their annual holidays? Yeah, and that would help Greece out. But Greece gave up that option. Now it's got a strong euro, the exchange rate of which is generally very strong. It goes into recession during the European debt crisis. How does it get out of this crisis? Well, interest rates during that crisis were lowered, but the euro remained remarkably strong. One of the good things, one of the powerful things about reducing interest rates during a recession is that your exchange rate drops, and then you can sell goods and services to foreigners, to foreign countries, because of the low exchange rate at much lower prices in terms of their currency. But Greece no longer has that option. It doesn't have a common fiscal authority, so it can borrow from Germany and France, but it's not a free fiscal transfer like we have in Australia. Labour and capital mobility doesn't seem to be high. If it was, they wouldn't have a 25% youth unemployment rate in Greece. And wage and price flexibility, well, obviously that doesn't exist in Greece, because if it did, their economy wouldn't be struggling as it did during the European debt crisis and for many years since then. It'd be interesting for you to have a look at the economic performance of Greece today. Many years after the European debt crisis, have things improved substantially? Have they improved to the same extent you would expect, say, the Victorian economy in Australia to improve if it went into a severe recession? Or is the Greek economy being hampered? Is its recovery being hampered by being part of this currency union? Interesting questions. Final slide for this case study. I've already spoken a little bit about the European debt crisis. It would be worthwhile just doing sort of 10, 15 minutes research and reading on the European debt crisis, just so that you understand sort of what went on at the time. But then the final point that I want to make. I started talking about this quite a few years ago, and when I started talking about it to students, some students thought I was absolutely crazy. I needed to be committed. The idea is a movement towards the United States of Europe. And at the time, people thought this was conspiracy theory. They thought I was crazy, etc., etc. But more recently, there have been politicians in Europe coming out and saying that Europe's move towards the United States of Europe needs to accelerate. And what this would basically involve is some sort of fiscal union, some sort of overarching fiscal power in Europe that could tax the Germans, tax the French. And I'm just using the Germans and the French as example of strong economies that are generally growing quite strongly and that are capable of absorbing higher tax rates, and move that money and spend it in the countries of Southern Europe to alleviate, to some extent, the asymmetry in business cycles. Okay, so the United States of Europe. Some people argue that that is where the powers that be in Europe always wanted Europe to move towards the United States of Europe. It's kind of, when you think about it, it's kind of odd that they would introduce, and when I say them, I'm talking about the politicians in Europe, the power brokers in Europe would introduce a common currency which had a single central bank and a single set of interest rates, and yet be naive enough to believe that it would work without moving to a full fiscal union. It's hard for me to believe that the leaders in Europe were that naive to think that a common currency could work without eventual fiscal union and the creation of the United States of Europe, which would pretty much reflect, it would operate in a similar way to, I guess, the United States of Europe eventually. Common fiscal authority, common central bank, common laws, well, that's already in place. A common defence force, well, there's moves towards that. And so the call has been getting louder and louder for full fiscal integration of Europe. And there's a lot out there that has been written by people. It's not conspiracy theory stuff. It's been written by some very respectable people. So it's worthwhile, if you're interested, having a look at this idea of the United States of Europe. Okay, a couple of final points before we wrap this up. If the politicians and the power brokers in Europe were actually targeting the eventual creation of the United States of Europe, why would they do that? What's the benefit of basically turning the separate countries of Europe into one big country? Well, one argument that's been put forward goes like this. Imagine what the world is going to look like, say 40, 50, 100 years from now, even 50 years from now. What's the world going to look like? You're going to have a massive, powerful China, a massive, powerful India. The United States is likely to have a larger population, probably then more like 500 million, and it's going to be very powerful economically, technologically. And then you've got Europe sitting there. How's Europe going to, if it was all of these separate countries, if the euro had never come into existence, you'd have all of these smaller countries battling for a place in this world that I've just described. So that could potentially be one advantage of creating one large country in Europe rather than a group of separate, smaller, less powerful, less influential countries. And so maybe all of this is beginning to sort of piece together in your mind now. So let's just imagine you're one of the power brokers in Europe, and this is all true. Let's assume that it's all true, that the introduction of the euro, or the euro was introduced for all of these reasons that I laid out. But ultimately, the thinking was that after the euro was introduced, there would be full fiscal integration and there would be a push towards the creation of the United States of Europe. And you're one of the people pushing for the euro, knowing that eventually full fiscal integration would be required for the reasons that I've given. Here's the question. If that was your plan all along, introduction of the euro, but then to continue pushing for the United States of Europe and a common fiscal authority, common laws, etc., and basically a breakdown of the barriers between countries and a breakdown of the identities of the people within those countries. So the Germans view themselves as European rather than Germans. So the French view themselves as Europeans rather than French. The Spanish view themselves as European more so than being Spanish. That's ultimately where you believe the European area needed to move. Would you tell the people of Europe that that was your plan? Interesting question. I would expect the answer would be no. Why? Probably too much revolt. What I'm getting at, and this has been raised by several authors, is that the people of Europe were never consulted on this. They certainly had an input into, or their say into, in terms of whether they adopted the euro or not. That was discussed at a national level. But if it is true what people are saying, and the introduction of the euro was just the first step in the creation of the United States of Europe, then certainly Europeans were never consulted about that. And if you wanted, if that was your agenda, it would be pretty wise to not consult people and tell them what the plan was from the very beginning. You just do it one step at a time. And here's the final point that I want to make about this. Once a country has adopted the euro, it's very hard to get out. Now, sure, we had Brexit, but the British, England, never adopted the euro. It stayed with the British pound. But once you've adopted the euro, it's very hard to go back out, to move out of it. Why? Okay, let's just imagine we'll go to the case of Italy now as an example. You're now the Italian Prime Minister. You wake up one day and you decide, I've had enough of the euro. I want to go back to the Italian lira. I want my own currency again. And you go on television, and let's just imagine you have the power to do this. You're almost a prime minister / dictator. Just for the sake of this exercise, this thought exercise, you can do whatever you like. You wake up one day and you announce it to the world's press that 2 months from now, Italy will be no longer using the euro, and it will be adopting its own currency. You can call it whatever you like. You don't have to give reasons why you're doing this. The reasons aren't important. I'm just demonstrating what would happen if a country did move out of the or try to stop using the euro currency. What's going to happen? The first thing that's going to happen the day you make that announcement as the supreme leader of Italy, international investors are going to start pulling their money out of your country. Why? Because when you introduce that new currency and go at it alone, there's going to be a major sell-off of that currency. People will be worried about your ability to stand on your own 2 feet. They're going to be worried about the macroeconomic performance moving forward. They're going to be worried about the performance of companies in your country. So day one, when your new currency debuts on foreign exchange markets, chances are there's going to be a very major sell-off because you're no longer part of this strong European Union. You're now going at it alone. And people will anticipate this. Investors aren't stupid. They're going to anticipate that the day that currency, that new currency of Italy is introduced, it's going to be sold off in a major way. And they're going to want to avoid that. So the day you make that announcement, international investors and probably some locals are going to be selling their shares, their bonds, and their real estate and moving money out of Italy as quickly as they possibly can because they know what's coming. That's going to cause an absolute collapse in asset prices. Bond yields are likely to then spike. If you're selling bonds, you're increasing the supply of bonds, prices fall, interest rates spike. And just that announcement is going to be is going to be a major problem. So I see a collapse in asset prices and the associated wealth effects and the associated reduction in consumption and investment spending as one of the main issues associated with even thinking about leaving the euro currency. Once you're there, it's really hard to back out. Investors will just get spooked. Your exchange rate will get trashed. Asset prices will fall. It would be very difficult imagining Italy in that case just not immediately going into recession. And it could be quite severe because you'd probably have sanctions put on you as well as a country. Restrictions like Britain was threatened with and hit with when it left under Brexit. We're talking about something even more severe. Changing your currency back. Who knows what sort of sanctions, trade restrictions, investment restrictions you'd be hit with if you decided to actually continue down this path. So once you're there, it's very hard to back out. So if you did want to make a push for the United States of Europe, that first step of monetary integration is a very sensible one, because once the countries are in there, it's hard for them to back out. They can't go back to the old way. Well, they could, but it's going to be very painful. So the path of least resistance might be to continue moving forward for a lot of these countries towards the United States of Europe.